Jon Owen, welcome to the Spiritual Misfits podcast. It is great to be with you this afternoon.
Oh, it's an honour to be able to share a little bit of stupidity with you, Will.
Wonderful. Well, let's just start with either the 30-second window or the bird's eye view of what the life of Jon Owen looks like right now in 2023.
Looks very weird. That's what it looks like. So, have been the pastor and CEO of Wayside Chapel, which is a small little corner store in the middle of King's Cross in Sydney's heart. And also in the last few years, we've opened up a little space down in Bondi Beach where we just throw our doors open and welcome everyone in with unconditional love and care for people who have fallen by the wayside of life. And we just sit back and watch what the power of love can do in people's lives. You know, we say that no one's a problem to be solved, they're a person to be met. And that is our guiding philosophy, really. And we sit back and just marvel at what happens through that kind of care and love. It's not rocket surgery, as they say. But it's pretty beautiful to be a witness to.
Awesome. Well, even pre-Wayside, Jon, you've been doing that. You've been living that life of really love in action, love in public, and in private, love in all the spaces of your life. And I remember the first time I met you and heard you share stories. I was reinvigorated and re-inspired around what a life of love in the neighborhood can look like. So I know many people listening to this will know of you and the work you do and the team at Wayside, and will have great admiration, I guess, from a distance. But I'm excited to delve a little bit more into what that looks like day to day. But for you, Jon, if we kind of go right back, maybe to some of your earlier days, could you share a little bit of your kind of faith backstory and whether or not you've ever felt like a spiritual misfit, and how that phrase might resonate with different parts of your journey?
Certainly that experience of being on the outer is something that has been with me for the duration of my life, even to a certain degree to this day. But rather than you seeing it as a source of sadness and perhaps even the discontent, it's become a source of comfort, strangely enough, as I've become an older man approaching the second half of life. So I migrated here with my family when I was a newborn from Malaysia, of Indian and Sri Lankan heritage. And so I always felt on the outer of things from a very young age. Objectively speaking, I was very different to everyone else who was in our little Aussie suburb. Mum freaked out and said, "I can't handle this," and took me and my 2-year-old sister back for a year or so and said to Dad, you set yourselves up and then call me. And so we came back when I was about 2 years old and settled into life. And we started attending a evangelical church that had a lot of Southeast Asian migrants that I now know Mum and Dad would attend just to feel a bit normal in the midst of white suburban Melbourne at the time through the early to mid 80s. And I was never really comfortable with the culture track that went with the faith track of that environment, which was basically using the scripture and God and our spiritual life in many beautiful ways. But the one that was difficult to cope with was that it was basically tacking God onto the highest values of the culture, saying, the best way to honor God is to honor your parents and to finish high school and go to university and get a good job. And pretty soon the hollowness of that showed itself in my own life, in my own heart. I got to a bit of a breaking point with about a year left at university. I always say that my favourite day of my first course at university was the first day, because I was so excited to find out what course my mum had chosen for me. Growing up as an Asian migrant kid, you live in the shadow of these great and towering expectations of who you are to be. And I kind of treated my faith like that a little bit too. And I got to a real crisis point back in the day, and there was a and a fiery old preacher on the campus, and campus life was pretty vibrant in Melbourne in the 90s. And it was a guy called Tony Campolo, who is just, as I'm aware, still with us. And he got up and he basically said to everyone, "Hey guys, you've made it. You know, you're the top of the pops. You're in university education in Australia. You know," he said, "your lives are going to be full, right? Usually, probably full of money and the accumulation of power." He said, "Why don't you just take 1 year out of your life and give it away, right? To go and volunteer somewhere." And so a lot of people who accepted that challenge, out of the couple of hundred that went forward, I think 5 of us actually did drop out of uni. 4 of them went overseas because they wanted to hold a baby in an overseas context. But being a migrant, I thought, I'm really grateful for the opportunities this country has given me. So I'm going to go down and find a community and a neighbourhood in this country, that where I can volunteer for a year. I'm not going to have a photo with a brown baby. I'll have a photo with a white baby. And so found this little organisation and completely blew my mind, completely reframed. I was also struggling with my faith, saying, "God, if it's all just about getting a good education and a university degree and 2.3 kids, I'll stick into it, but my heart's not going to be in there. I'll stick into it for mum, I'll stick into it for dad, I'll keep going to church, and I'll raise my little 2.3s the same way." But there was no kind of sense of fulfillment or purpose in there, and I would often be plagued by dreams every night of, not dreams, but I'd just go to bed saying, I still, what's the purpose of all this? And going there, it was within the first day, I suddenly saw, life was breathed into these dusty old scriptures. All of a sudden, you could see it coming to life. Stories of love and compassion and care. It was a little organisation that went out into neighbourhoods that others would prefer to avoid, that we were certainly taught to avoid. And they not only went to those neighbourhoods, they moved into those communities and they opened their doors and their homes and their hearts to others and took people in off the streets who needed care for, and took in women who were escaping family and domestic violence, and lived and worked for the betterment of the community, very much in the Isaiah way, which says, "Go to the city in which I have sent you," and which was right in the midst of exile, and saying, work for the betterment of the city. And so that's what we were doing, working for the betterment of the city, building community. And we saw so many beautiful things occur. That 1 year of volunteering turned into 20 years, and I never went back to that university course, and have never regretted it, except when the annual HEX bill comes through for 5 years of a 6-year degree that was never quite completed. But, it was from that moment that my head has never hit the pillow ever again, and woken up wondering, is there more to life than this? It's been a wonderful journey of taking in people, doing home detoxes from heroin, working and taking in people who are seeking asylum, escaping federal police, all sorts of things, all in the name of love, all in the name of Jesus. And it's been quite the joyous journey every way through, because there's no safer place to be than in the center of God's will for your life. But I think it was that kind of divine discontent that drove me to the search for what's more, and what shape am I, and what shape is the call that God's placed upon me to live while I'm here.
I can think about that story you shared of Tony Campolo. Kind of gives an incredible talk. I imagine he's a great communicator. A couple hundred people in the moment, it seems like a great idea. They get inspired. Only a handful follow through. And I think even for the handful that follow through, potentially there could be a gap between the kind of romanticized idea in your head around, oh, yes, I'd love to go and give my life away and live more in alignment with Jesus, and I'm young and I'm passionate and radical. Those kind of moments can swell up for people. But there's a difference between that and then actually sticking through it and being kind of in the trenches, so to speak. Have you had moments? Obviously, it sounds like that there's that strong sense of call, but that's some full-on stuff you described there, Jon. Like, have you had moments where you have felt, I guess, that it's too difficult or that the challenges have been too great in that space? Or, speak about some of the tensions of actually continuing to show up kind of in those marginal spaces or less desired suburbs.
Yeah, that's a very good way of phrasing it, Will. I have had the honour of being a part of so many people's lives and of seeing God working in the lives of people who were sleeping rough, addicted to heroin, been right in the middle of gang fights, been right, been I'm an Indian kid who's, been inside prisons and ministering to men in there. And yet I would always say the bravest thing I ever did was wake up the day after Tony Campolo and actually front up to volunteer at an organization. That is definitely the thing that took the most courage, to step out into that stream. Once I dipped my toe in the river, it's really been a case of never looking back.
Mm.
There have been moments of exhaustion, but there have been moments of elation as well. And I really think that when we often talk about burnout in ministry, it's a real thing. I think it is far more aligned not with working too hard. I think it is working for too long in an area that's outside of your gifts and callings and passions. So, there have been moments where I have been doing things that weren't quite in alignment with what I was meant to be doing, that have led to tiredness. I always say, everyone, I do go back to our philosophy. No one's a problem to be solved; they're a person to be met. And if I ever engage in anything other than meeting people, if I try and manage them, I'll walk away from this exhausted. I'll walk away from it on the edge of frazzlement. Whereas if I walk away feeling met rather than worked on, and that's the gift I try and give others, is then I walk out of there, honestly, with more energy than when I walked in. I had a day recently, and I'm not young anymore. I started at 8 a.m. and finished at 3 a.m. But the whole day was just beautiful alignment. Had a nap in the middle of the day, but and it wasn't a usual day. It was a very unusual day. But I the next day, everyone said, "Oh, you should be exhausted." I said, "No, I'm not. I wasn't in the least." No, I mean, it's important that we get the right rest and all that. But wow, it was when you're doing the stuff that whenever it is, and I think the good hint for you living in your gifts is when you kind of do something. It might not be easy, but you get that sense that God's patting you on the back, saying, "Yeah, that's what you were here for, mate. That's why you were here."
Mm. I imagine, John, that like the shape of your Christianity has been kind of reformed or reshaped over time as you've moved deeper into that. There's a practice, there's a life, but obviously always in the background there are kind of how we conceptualize and think about God. And again, like one message is, well, Christianity is just something you add on top of the kind of Western dream, which is quite a contrast to Christianity. Maybe helps you to invert that whole thing. Would you say that there are either key ideas or key kind of streams of Christian thought, people like Tony, but others that have helped along the years to kind of reshape how you actually think about the kind of stuff in the head as you live out, with your hands and your heart, what Christianity looks like?
Yeah, significantly, a reframing around that whole journey has been facilitated by who I would describe as my heroes of the faith. And some of them have been people who I've had the privilege of being in relationship with, as well as some authors that kind of blaze the way. The discovery that all truth comes from the margins, and instead of from the centers of things, has been a big stream of theological and big theological strand that has been really developed from the 60s and 70s from the liberation theologians, of that era, that led into the Ched Myers of this world. And so they've been incredibly formative right through now to a Nadia Bolz-Weber, who bring us alternative perspectives on ways we can read the Bible and to get back to the heart of what Jesus was all about, and to really recapture the social justice message. I kind of jumped into the stream where the debate was alive and well. It was framed up as evangelism versus social action, and probably not so much a debate that goes around as prevalently as now. But the spirit was really blowing through the church in the 60s and 70s and 80s, saying that God has a bias. The bias from the bottom, the priority for the poor. And so to drink deeply of those resources, I still do to this very day. Anything by Orbis Books or Fortress Press often finds it into my reading list. And then I got to meet people like Daryl Gardner, who is a key New Zealand leader in churches who started something called THO, Tihau Order, in its inceptions that came out of Youth for Christ, and Michael Duncan, who was in an organisation started by a guy called Viv Grigg called Servants to Asia's Urban Poor, and including the founding couple of Urban Neighbours of Hope, where I spent 20 years of my life there. So, it's been good to have and Dave Andrews as well, who is just an amazing Christian leader.
He's been on the podcast. Yeah, it was incredible chat.
Brisbane Jesus. Gotta love him, as we call him. So, to have these people in my life, Nick White, Billy Williams, all amazing leaders who have taught me so much.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I always think it's weird when people criticize, that kind of social gospel. So I'm like, what's the alternative? Like an anti-social gospel? I mean, it just doesn't. It seems crazy that that's even a debate that people try to have. And I suppose for me, it's all of that kind of liberation theology and those kind of people you've named, those flesh and blood examples like Dave Andrews. That I guess without those, I would find Christianity so hollow and lacking. But it kind of can completely reanimate it when you come across some of those different ways of viewing things from the margins, from the edges. And for me, making this kind of podcast is constantly interviewing people who speak about how they have found life, beauty, wonder in all the unexpected places, often of rejection, marginalization, or kind of it's the strange places that the Spirit kind of, the light kind of comes through the cracks. But there are lots of tensions, right? Like one phrase that Wayside Chapel is known for, which I think is beautiful, is this idea of like, there's no us and them. That's kind of like the mantra for Wayside Chapel. I hear that, I feel goosebumps, I get inspired. But then I think about how often Christianity, maybe specifically Western Christianity, but maybe broader than that, is very good at us and them. We're brilliant at us and theming. And again, maybe that's broader than Christianity. Maybe that's just like a human kind of mindset. But I was wondering, John, like, what does it actually look like to have things in place that continue to break down or that provide guardrails against maybe our like natural drift towards us and theming the world?
I heard someone once say that, it's very difficult to create a religion without a God, but it's almost impossible to create a religion without a devil. And, it almost is a truism. I mean, it's clearly not a real statement, but, just if you build your identity upon superiority or upon judgment or upon how you are somehow the chosen people in opposition to the unchosen or the great unwashed, then you are building your household on a very shaky foundation. So it is something that we are committed to here. It's something we speak about all the time. It's something we have to keep front and center because as humanity, we naturally drift into being creatures of comfort. And we quickly realize that the greatest enemy of faith isn't struggle. It's comfort, in fact. So how do we continue to be on the lookout for who is being excluded from our society, and how can we walk in solidarity with them? We really focus. We say to everyone, we just need you to come into this place when you open the doors and be you. We don't need you to suck on a pen or say to anyone, I can see you're having a bad day. It's, we just say, just shut up and listen. Just shut up and listen, because there's a gift there. There is a gift there. And our model of ministry moves far more from we are the people of the light and there are others in the darkness and we need to drag them into the light, far more to what Charles Spurgeon said, which is, I'm but one beggar helping another beggar find bread. It's important that we know where we stand in that conversation, though. We say that we're soft at the edges and hard at the centre. That's a Dave Andrews quote, is to say we are loving, we are approachable, but we know where we stand because people do value that. We have significant work amongst some of the youth in this area, and they once said to us, in a bit of an open sharing forum, they said, look, we present as being so clever and so smart, but we really do crave love and direction and care. So let's not abandon all our foundations in order to create a dialogue, but how can we honestly walk into every interaction saying, there's something I can contribute here, but there's also something I can learn. And that's a very different mindset and paradigm for going out in Christian ministry. It's not arming yourself with tracts and arming yourself with answers and going through a bit of an action, reflection, learning phase, though action is important with reflection as well. But it's not how to trick people better. It's, let's stop worrying about all the nouns and just focus on the verbs that we know. Go out and love, care for each other, and trust that God's at work in that.
Yeah, it's good stuff, John. I think it is sort of a constant thing to guard against, and even whether it's in social work contexts more broadly or in churches and ministries, I think, to kind of be hyper aware of our tendency to take on a kind of rescuing mindset or a savior kind of mindset. And I know that, obviously for social workers, there is a whole bunch of best practice stuff that is all about not doing that, and the conversation continues to evolve. But have you ever felt that that's been a challenge in terms of like having to reposition from, as you're saying, like going in as the kind of the light into the darkness? Could you just unpack a little bit more around, how to actually avoid that kind of rescuing mindset, which I think is just such a trap for people that may go, yeah, I'd love to go out and sign up and help out, but it can come, and maybe initially it often does come from some sort of superiority mindset. But yeah, that wrestle, how do you kind of keep taking that
it's a
into the ring?
westernized mindset, Will, that just, 50 years ago, Mother Teresa used to come to Australia and she would say, loneliness is the leprosy of the West. Right? Is there anything worse than the feeling of being unloved or unwanted? When we, and the systems and the structures that we've developed to help people are just really to fix them. If someone finally has the courage to walk through any doorway and say, I need help, often the process is to meet them with a clipboard and a pill and a program and a pamphlet and hand it to them, and they'll often walk away feeling just as lonely and misunderstood as when they walked through the door. Even the way we talk to people, in the middle of someone sharing, we'll say, have you tried quinoa? That might revolutionize your life, and we just do it, and there's a reflexive push away. And, we say if people we know, look, the sign of a life that's falling apart is driven by two questions, right? One is, what can you give me? And what's the most I can get for the least? All right. We live in King's Cross, Potts Point, and we also operate in Bondi, right? You don't have to be homeless to be driven by those two questions. What can you give me, and what's the most I can get for the least cost? Right? we know that a sign that a life is about to turn around is when the question changes to how can I help? What can I do in this space? And, we have 4 or 5% of our staff first walk through our front doors looking for help. There's something beautiful that happens when people walk away from here feeling met rather than worked on, and that miracle's about to happen, is they often move towards life by themselves. And that's when we throw all our love and support behind them. When all the care, we always, the best thing we can do is meet people, connect with them, love them. And, often that means instead of trying to fix people or rescue people, the greatest contribution I can make in ministry sometimes is grief. I remember a year or two ago saying to a young lad who was trying to kill himself with heroin, said, mate, I wish you could see what I see. I wish you could see the potential. I'm a minister. I will give you the most beautiful funeral, and I will weep through the whole funeral, but I wish I didn't have to. And thankfully, he was able to have that moment where he realised he was made for so much more. Everyone has a right. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Everyone has a right to make a decision, even a bad one. Anything else would be manipulative. And so we just sit there with open arms, but also broken hearts.
I love the dignifying of people in that, and the leveling out of the ground. And I was reading actually, one of an article on the SBS sort of around you and Wayside. And there was this quote in there from you, Jon, where you said kind of the approach of yourself and many of the volunteers at Wayside is this idea of there's no hole so deep that I'm not going to be there with you. We often say I'd rather be lost with you than saved without you. And I feel like that is one of those phrases that on the one hand sounds like something I could imagine directly coming from the lips of Jesus. And yet it sort of sounds like it's very different from a lot of often evangelical, Christian ethos that is around, well, the most important thing is my personal salvation. But this idea of I would be lost, I'd rather be lost with you, is a really beautiful and very different idea to what maybe a lot of us are exposed to growing up in church. Do you want to share any more about that, kind of being lost with people rather than saved without them?
Some of the greatest scriptures, and when people ask me to pray, I don't freestyle. It's more just comes from some of the ancient scriptures, and say, fear not, for I am with you. I have redeemed you. I've called you by name. Child, you are mine. But the only time I believe God actually vocalizes that God loves us in God's own voice, which is quite a beautiful phrase. But for I am with you. So how do we walk with people? In the middle of our chapel, we have a little altar, and underneath it is a little hidden crucifix with quite a distorted face of Jesus screaming out in pain and anger. And we have many people who are walking in who are sleeping on our streets and who are just living with the impacts of long-term abuse from people who were meant to care for them, who are escaping family and domestic violence. And it is not uncommon for me to walk into the chapel and find someone weeping and holding that face that's just at floor level, saying, if there is a God who is suffering, then that's a God I can understand. And that's a powerful image and a powerful metaphor and a powerful reminder, particularly as we go through the Easter event, is to say that, there is no hole so dark and deep that God's not at the bottom of it already. God weeps with us. I always think of Paula Diasi's story, when she had lost everything and wept for a year at her kitchen table after the death of her husband and her child. And after a year of anger and pain, she was weeping at the table of her childhood that she grew up around. And she felt God's presence alongside her weeping. And that's where she came up with the phrase, God comes to you disguised as your life. not the one you planned for or dreamt for or hoped for, but the one that you have. And when you are weeping, God is weeping with you too. And that is an image of a God who identifies with us in our pain and suffering and gives people actually far more hope than any kind of saccharine picture that is devoid from suffering and engagement in this world as it is, because there's a lot of pain and a suffering out there. And, we always say if someone promises to relieve your pain, buy a kilo or whatever they're selling, because that ain't what life's about. There's the normal graph of human life is like a up and down curve, right? It has highs and it has lows, and we have it and then we lose it. When we're at the heights, we all our words are we, and when we're at the lows, all our words are I, me. Our pronouns change in how we refer to ourselves, and we got to realize that the impulse to stay high is the impulse of an addict. We live in an addicted society. We run away from our feelings, we run away from our emotions, we medicate, we purchase, we do everything we can to avoid suffering, yet that is where God is to be found. And so we should be very wary of any religion or any faith or version of our faith that says, give your life to Jesus and all your pain and suffering will disappear. How much pain and suffering does that phrase cause in many people's lives, as opposed to sitting with someone going, that sucks, I am here with you. Fear not, for I am with you. Even as you walk through the valley of the shadow of death.
I've been thinking leading up to Easter, and this conversation will be released just after Easter, but I've been thinking about this quote from G.K. Chesterton. He said, Christianity has died many times and risen again, for it had a God who knew the way out of the grave. And in the context of everything we've been kind of talking about, I do feel like there are many forms of Christianity that it feels like, for a lot of the people I sort of spend time with, have let them down. And it feels like they have provided the solution to a problem rather than a robust spirituality of suffering, and we're just seeing, I feel like, a very tumultuous time in the West of certain forms of church and churchianity and Christianity and institution, maybe going through some forms of death, kind of writhing around. But I do kind of keep this hope alive that, if this is built in the space of the God who can escape the grave, that maybe there is a renewed form of Christian faith for all my friends who feel at the moment very let down and disappointed and betrayed by what Christianity has been. I would just wonder, Jon, as you think about just kind of some of those trends that we're seeing, some of what is happening in terms of, just not only the decline of attendance in church, but a real like disappointment with the version of Christianity that people have been given. What are some things that you see that you think are in the process of dying, and maybe that's a good thing?
Yeah.
And what are some things you'd love to see emerge from the grave?
Look, I don't offer comfort so much as I offer apologies for everyone who has been hurt and broken by some of the institutionalized forms of abuse that they've suffered, whether it be spiritual abuse or, with Royal Commissions showing that it was far more than just spiritual abuse for so many. It's a tragedy, actually, that we who follow Jesus, who follow someone we claim as Saviour, who died and came back to life in a classic, beautiful resurrection, are so afraid of death, particularly the institutional church. And often in the death throes is where the greatest damage is done, because there is a retreat into fundamentalism. There's a retreat into familiarity. There's a retreat into identity politics, the us and them of this world. And so the rearguard action as the institutionalized church continues to die is vicious. It is the biggest backlash that we are facing, that is hurting people. People we see across denominations are retiring, and their final acts are being sign on the dotted line, or you're out of our congregations or our denominations better. And we're losing touch with the victims of society, when we follow one who, whenever there would be any conflict, would always be on the side of the victim. And we're living in times where we have lost so much perspective that we have people who have all the power claiming to be the victims as well. It's a brutal time, Will. And so I offer that as the contours of the landscape, but I don't offer it as anything other than a way to explain why I'm so deeply sorry, because I'm seeing it across more than one denomination. I see egos and agendas. I see the Australian version of make God great again by making God hate again, and it just breaks people open. Whereas when what we do here is we just look for signs of life in people. Where's the Spirit at work, and go with that. And do we trust the Spirit? Because I think any attempt to define what God hates is a human endeavor, not a spiritual one. Whereas we look, where's the Spirit leading us? The Spirit leads us into joy, love, but also into the most unexpected and beautiful of places. I'm sitting there working with right now to conduct the funeral of a street sex worker, and she has opened up to me, her best friend, who also worked, about all the issues and injustices they face. They have no rights, and who's going to stand up and advocate for them? And I can see we're having beautiful talk. She even said to me, she said, her own inimitable way, she said, "You know why I got into sex work? Because when I was trying to be good, I knew Jesus would hate that, but I knew he hung out with the prostitutes." So she said, and so I know he is there by my side. And wow, you're right. Everything I was taught was that you're wrong, but actually you're right. So, man, and but the way the church is splitting up over marriage equality right now just breaks my heart. Because where I see the Spirit at work is in the queer community. Half of my ministers and staff are people who are deeply committed to making this world a better place, who are living out the Isaiah 65 vision for the world, where there is housing for all, where there is dignity in labour, where there is access to enough food, where you are no longer producing so that others may consume. And I say that's where there is life. That's where there is the Spirit. The valley of dry bones is quickly coming back to life. And amongst the people who you and I would expect the least, but God doesn't give a darn about that. God just looks at the heart.
I 100% agree with that, John. And deeply appreciate everything you just said. I think it's so tricky because it's sort of like we live in a time where everything we're talking about, like there's these big contrasts, but the language is often the same. And that's what's hard is, if the language of Bible and prayer and Jesus has been used by this side over here that's propping up power and institution and privilege, and then I'm expected to try and transfer some of that same language and some of those same stories and some of those same frameworks into here in the margins and the gutter. Sort of like it's just so difficult to navigate that, and there can be quite a bit of whiplash. Have you ever felt, and you feel free to not answer this. I mean, you're obviously a wonderful minister, deeply grounded in the way. But have you ever felt like, something like the scripture, it's just hard to pick up when it's been so weaponized? Or how do you actually come at it and avoid that distortion of, man, we're all using the same language. But I need some help navigating the complexity of this.
Look, words create our worlds, and how we use them, we can use them to heal, or we can use them as weapons. And so one of the most powerful ways of interpreting scripture is through the lens of being from the gutter up. So one of my favorite passages would have been the first hymn, the poem Philippians 2:5-11, where it is all about a downward movement. He's not considering equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptying ourselves. So how do we continue to empty ourselves so that we can Take everything we've heard, everything we've learned, everything we've been taught, and be present to the pain of this world. Kyle Slab, who's a Bundjalung elder up in Tweed Head, said, who is an elder in the Aboriginal community, in his community, says, the reason we go through all the law and have to learn different languages, the whole purpose of that is to be useful for your mob. What's the point in getting all this knowledge that puffs up if you don't have love, if you're not useful for your community? And so one of the most powerful things I learned, though, in helping to interpret Scripture is I don't meet any atheists who sleep rough. The only people who want to argue about the existence of God is intellectuals and people who know far more Bible verses at the tip of the hat than I do. But when I hang out the front, there is disappointment with God. There is devastation at the way people's lives have turned out. And I use that as the interpretive lens to help reframe everything I would say or speak or share.
Mm.
Sorry.
You're right. One thing I remember finding really helpful, John, when I heard you speak a number of years ago, because I suppose I think about King's Cross and Wayside Chapel and some of the stuff you're talking about. I think about my particular street, my context, and there are absolutely very real challenges here, but it's a very different context. And there's a part of me that when I first listened to you, I was like, should I move into some urban inner city area and kind of do what John's doing? And you talked about this idea that the need doesn't constitute the call. Yeah. And kind of this affirming, and as you said earlier in our conversation, that you found that it was really what has sustained you in what could be very difficult places is being in the space that feels like it actually matches, who you are and how you're wired. Could you share a little bit more for people that are maybe listening from very different contexts, thinking, do I need to move into an area where there's sex workers or drug addicts or, but that's very different to my context, or wherever people are, what would be some things you'd say around discovering a sense of call in different places?
Fantastic, Will. Really, honestly, at the core of it all is that, not everyone is called to sell everything they got and to move into a community where they throw open their doors. One of the most helpful books I read and recommend to everyone is Parker Palmer's Let Your Life Speak. It's a very short book. It's my kind of book. It's 80 pages long. And it seeks to do that work where we circle to right about what we talked at the start of this podcast, Will, which is finding your shape and finding your call and your passion that God has placed upon your heart and going and doing that. I would say, most of us who have grown up in churches, we'd hear a rousing talk from some person from some organization or someone who'd be overseas and then come and talk to your church. And, we get driven by these, I should do that, or I should do that, or I should do this. And we can often get, analysis paralysis, which cause should I be on, in collectivism and, I'm a part of everything, and it creates all this anxiety. Whereas what we should rather do is just take some time just to wait until something really just lands in our heart and we find that we're not free not to do something about it, and go listen to your heart and go follow that. And the most courageous thing you'll ever do is take the first step again. I've seen people who said, I should be doing that kind of work, and stop, don't shoot on yourself. Don't shoot all over yourself. Just wait. You'll know when the right time is. Also, God's call on your life. I was so long driven by the concept that it was it was one thing at one time. It was moving to Cambodia in 1994. And if I missed that plane, then I'd miss the call on my life. Whereas God's call on your life is far more like, and I'll use an analogy that from a sport I have no ability in, which is surfing. Which is to say, it's like surfing. There are waves, and if you miss one wave, there's another wave. Your life hasn't passed you by just because you missed that wave or you bombed out on it. It's about picking yourself back up, working out who is in your corner, and getting back on the board and having another go. God's call has a trajectory rather than a single point within it for anyone's life. And there are seasons where you can be in and out, called in and out too. You might need a rest. You might need a break. There are, if the seasons of our lives go through our youth, through to maybe building our households and our families, and life doesn't stop there. We have a stupid version of a culture that says life stops at 21, and every attempt is to get back to that. With whatever needles and creams you need to get back there. Whereas that's a culture of non-wisdom. The goal of most cultures is to become the elder at the city gates. And so how do we move beyond the householder phase into the forest dweller and the wise elder phase? There are different phases where we have different tasks to accomplish in life. And one of those is the householder phase and raising families for some people and caring for others, caring for elderly parents in that. That's all in part and parcel of this thing called life. Your call doesn't exempt you from any of that, as it doesn't exempt you from pain, suffering, and loss. I've got many friends who have gone on this beautiful journey and have lost families, marriages, children along the way. And it's been a very painful but powerful experience.
Some of these ideas, listening to your life, learning to kind of be in the grief and the lament, that is kind of the language of the contemplatives and the mystics. And I think it's particularly hard to do some of those things in a culture that is about that being addicted to the constant high, the constant move, the constant, like for me, I run away from my pain through busyness and entertainment. And I'm really drawn to the idea of sitting in the actual grief and the lament and the shit of things. But it's hard to do because I got all of these learned habits of staying on the treadmill and keeping on going. Do you have thoughts around either practices or disruptions or things that can help us to actually listen to our lives and to sit in the space where we might hear a different voice?
Mm-hmm. So I've got some practices that have sustained me for the 25, 30 years I've been doing this, that I have a mentor who walks with me who asks me the questions, and so I know my own metrics in my life and how to stay on an even keel, and that means I have to have exercise in my life. I have to have meditation in my life and prayer. I have to be reading something that is non-work or preaching or thing focused or anything focused, and time with family as well. So these are some of the things that keep me in an even keel. But what keeps my nose to the grindstone, and journaling is a key for me. I never can recognize where God's at work in the moment, if ever. But once I sit down and look back and do an examine of conscience, which is on a weekly basis, is I can see where God's at work, and that kind of inspires me to push on. And also just regular time out the front. One of my mantras is be connected. I can never rest on the fact I've done this for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. People only care about how kind you are to them on the day. And so by being connected and being open and listening with a loving, non-judgmental, open, safe space for people is so powerful and healing, and essential if we're to sustain ourselves in being a spiritual misfit.
That's great, John. And I think there's sort of like maybe a crossover between. I feel like the way you answered that was acknowledging how you've figured out not only your own personal calling, but your personal sense of what helps to sustain that. And so maybe for each person listening, there's just as much work to be done in a sense in figuring out what are the things that help to still your choppy waters.
Yep.
And whether it's journaling or walking or, catching up with the right person on a regular basis, it's going to look different for each of us, but find those things. Awesome. Well, John, I really appreciate your time. You're a busy guy. You do wonderful things. And I think you've definitely inspired me and others who will listen to this. Would love to just hand it over to you kind of for your final couple sentences, things that you would most want those who find themselves on the fringes of faith or spirituality, um, more questions than answers. For people listening in those spaces, what would be some of the key ideas or thoughts that you would most want to share with them?
Just keep on keeping on, in terms of, if you find yourself dissatisfied with easy answers, then bless you, you are on the path. Truth will never be found at the center of things. It's always found in the voices that we are trained to tune out of our lives. If you want to find Christ, go find where the suffering is, and you'll find him there, and join him there. And, always keep front and center. I'm just one beggar helping another beggar find bread. Be true to your journey. Stop telling the lies we've been trained to tell, which is, once you're with Jesus, it's all gravy, baby. No, we grow, we age, we develop, things die, dreams die, hopes die. Our children don't turn out the way that we want them to turn out. Our parents die. Our friends who we journeyed with burnt out and drop out of faith. How do we continue to love and care for them? You're doing the right things, and it's sadly generally not going to look like turning up at a church on a Sunday. I wish it was. I pray that it can be.
Thanks so much, Jon.
Thanks, Will.